You know, over the last 4 years, Mysteries of the Superstition Mountains has covered an awful lot of ground. And in doing so, there have been an awful lot of questions come into us about things that we've talked about. And obviously, we can't talk about all those topics all over again, and we can't answer all the questions at one time. But we can answer a couple of them a bit at a time. The Superstition Mountain Wilderness, now to start with, was designated as a primitive area back in 1939, and it was expanded to its present size in 1984. It now contains approximately 160,200 square acres and 250 square miles of land. To be clear, now the Superstition Mountain is just a small part of the Superstition Wilderness. And we have to tell you that now that this mountain is actually the result of intensive volcanic activity eons ago. And that raises part of the problems that people have, understanding that there's gold in volcanic activity areas. People say that just can't be true, but we know that it is true.
Well, you know, I've heard that all the time I've been out here in Arizona since the 50s. Even the Forest Service says it, that there's no gold in volcanic material. But you know, Clay Wurst told me that 3 of the 4 best producing gold mines in the world aren't exactly the same kind of volcanic material as the Superstition Mountains. And he ought to know. He owns a gold mine right in Goldfield, Arizona. You know, our first illustration here is showing that there is multiple volcanoes in the Superstition Mountains. The top of the picture shows 3 cones coming up, and then the next illustration below it shows the Superstition Mountain as a caldera. They collapsed completely as a caldera, and then the bottom portion shows the resurgent caldera being pushed up out of the ground again over a period of time by magma. And you notice on either side of the superstitions are lots of faults and other calderas. In our next illustration, this shows the calderas in the Superstition area. The one that says H is the Hidden Canyon caldera. Now, we were over there not too awful long ago and done a story on the Lost Diamond Mine over to Gold Gulch, the entrance to Hidden Canyon. And there's a mining operation over there, I believe it's by the Canadians, that has an open pit mine in that very caldera. And here's a picture of it. And that mine is that open pit mine is 1,000 feet deep. And here's another picture of a caldera called the Black Mountain Caldera in the Superstitions, directly north of Weaver's Needle. And it's actually Garden Valley. And as you look at the picture, you can see a complete circle with Black Mountain on the right, or at least part of it. And you can see the circle of rock around the caldera, which is the Garden Valley itself. In our next illustration, we have the Goldfield Mining District. And you can see all the faults that are associated with the collapsed caldera. Goldfield itself is an immense collapsed caldera. At one time, it was a mountain. It was a volcano. The whole Goldfield Mining District was a volcano that collapsed into a caldera. And look at all the fault lines that are in this. And notice, if you will, all the mines are following that main fault that runs north and south. One of the faults goes off to the left where Bulldog Mine is and comes across and goes right across the corner of the Superstition Museum. And another fault goes to the right of it, which is that ridge behind the museum. Our next illustration shows all the faults on what we call Barkley Basin. If you'll notice in the upper left corner, you see Weaver's Needle, which has 2 faults running right at its base, and then All the faults are splitting off of it into the east side of the Superstition Mountains where the dacite cliffs are. In our next illustration, I want to show you Palmer Mine. Palmer Mine is located on a fault that goes right along the cliff edge of the Superstition Mountains. And an interesting thing I found out about these faults was these calderas that I just showed you. Goldfield is located at an elevation of 2,031 feet. The Palmer Mine is up on the slopes of the Superstitions at 2,400 feet elevation. And when they went down 250 feet to reach the gold, they were at the same level as the gold that was found at Goldfield. Then go back over to Hidden Valley Caldera, where that open pit mine was at 1,000 feet. And it is just 100 feet different than where the gold was found at Goldfield. And I thought that was rather unusual. I'm not trying to make anything out of that. It's just unusual that where they really got the gold was the same level. The next illustration I want to show is in 1887, the largest earthquake that ever took place in Arizona was the Babvist earthquake. That was a 7.6 earthquake that took place south of the border, but opened up a fault that was 33 miles long and raised one side of it 15 feet. It was felt as far away as Albuquerque, clear over to the California border at Yuma, and up far as north as Flagstaff. A lot of people at Fort McDowell reported that they saw a lot of dust rising up out of the Superstition Mountains along the Salt River about 6 miles above Fort McDowell. As you look at some of these balanced rocks in the Superstition, you can find where some of them had kind of fell over against each other, but it really didn't cause that much shaking because a lot of them didn't fall at all. And the reported earthquake was 7.2 in the Phoenix area. So many geologists claim that Superstition Mountain itself is the largest resurgent caldera on the planet. There was a tremendous amount. The whole area in the gold fields and in the Superstition wilderness is all volcanic, and gold is found in many places. And if you really want to find some, you need to study where these faults are.
So what you're telling me is that I can probably go up into the Superstitions, and if I dig a hole deep enough, I'm probably going to hit some gold or something down there somewhere.
I would think that might be the case.
Well, another one of the questions that pops up, I think you covered that pretty well, Larry. Another one of the questions that pops up all the time, because we talk about the Lost Dutchman mine, which always provokes questions of all sorts. One of the problems that is brought up all the time is, where is it? Where are the clues? What are these clues? And the other one that pops up that always frustrates me is people trying to figure out, Jacob Waltz said this was here and Jacob Waltz says it was there. And back then, places didn't even have names. So how could he even have been talking about places with names?
Well, we done a story called Dutchman Clues Made Easy, and we'd like people to go back and watch that rather than repeat the whole thing. But it is true that Jacob Waltz couldn't have told anybody to go up East Boulder Canyon to Blacktop Mesa, because none of those mountains or canyons had a name at that time. The only two landmarks out there that had a name was Superstition Mountain proper, just the mountain itself, and Weaver's Needle. All those other mountains out there and all those canyons did not have a name of any kind.
Well, another one of the questions, now that we're talking about the clues themselves, that always comes up is the military trail confusion. Is there anything you can say about that that maybe clear this up forever and ever?
Well, in that same story, Dutchman Clues Made Easy, we showed a map of all the canyons out there, but I'm here to tell you that every canyon out there was a military trail.
So what we're saying is pretty much any place the military went, it's fair to call it a military trail, so you can take your pick.
Exactly.
I've got another one for you then, Larry. The board house. What makes the board house clue so doggone important, and everybody seems to get it wrong all the time? It's not at the Quarter Circle U Ranch.
Everybody over the years has thought that it was at the Quarter Circle U Ranch, but when we come up with Cavanius's memoirs or his diary, we were able to take that picture and prove that it was over by the Daysite Cliffs. It was at least 3/4 of a mile to a mile due west of the Quarter Circle U Ranch, plus the fact that the Quarter Circle U Ranch didn't exist until 1907, and the board house was built 1875. Now, the problem is if you left from the board house, you would enter the mountain one way, but if you left from Quarter Circle U Ranch later, you'd enter from a completely different direction.
So what we're saying is, from people conveying that clue down through the years, calling it the Quarter Circle U Ranch was strictly for convenience, because there was no Quarter Circle U Ranch to begin with.
That's right.
It just wasn't there.
Yeah, well, that's correct. But you know, after Adolph Ruth's body was found in 1931, which made huge headlines, Tex Barkley, he got tired of all the Dutch hunters coming out to the board house to start looking for the mine, so he tore it down.
I can understand how Tex Barkley felt, and I understand why he tore it down. And you know what? On a personal note, for me, it's almost impossible for me to wrap my head around the fact that people believe that Jacob Walsh, on his deathbed, is completely overcome with pneumonia. He's going to die before Sunday morning gets around. And supposedly, he's talking about copious numbers of clues with names, and on and on and on he goes. And we know that those clues have changed over the years. Maps are incorrect. So it gets a little bit ridiculous, as far as I'm concerned, to even try and think that Jacob Walsh could have said all the what people think he said.
Well, I have to agree with you. There's on his deathbed with his last dying breath, he went through all those clues. I just don't think so.
I don't think so either. Okay, well, let's look at this then. The Quarter Circle U Ranch has always been a part of so many of the stories. It's been at the forefront for as long as I can remember. So who actually owned it, and who did Tex Barkley buy it from? This ranch is roughly 78,000 acres, or 117 sections. So it's not like some little place that's sitting out there with a barn on it.
Well, we got to remember the board house was built in 1875, and there wasn't any Forest Service out here at that time.
No.
And there wasn't any grazing permits established. So Cavanius come out here, and did he buy anything? He just built a house out there. He didn't buy all those acres, you know. And the next person that come along in 1880 was Marlowe and his partner. Well, Marlowe bought out his partner, but he had a board house and some cattle to buy. That's what he was buying. He wasn't buying all this extensive acreage that later came along. And then in 1907, Tex Barkley and his partner, who he bought out, purchased the cattle and started the Quarter Circle U Ranch. And there again, it wasn't until 1919 until the Forest Service and the BLM started issuing permits for grazing out there. He didn't buy all that land. He just turned his cattle loose, and wherever they went, they were on his property.
So even at that time, we're talking about with Bark, when James Bark had that whole property, or whatever it was he had, he fell under the same rules that you're saying now. And so Tex Barkley actually bought whatever it was he bought from Jim Bark. Is that right?
I think I left somebody out because Cavanis sold it to Marlowe. Marlowe sold it to Bark, and Barkley bought it from Bark.
Okay, I see now. I was just worried a little bit because James Bark was in there somewhere, and I couldn't place what was going on there for a second. Okay, one of the subjects that comes up all the time is the fact that we know that Dick Holmes was at the bedside of Jacob Waltz when he died. We've also heard an awful lot about what is called the Holmes manuscript. People hold that thing as gospel, and they have for years. But there exist an awful lot of questions surrounding that manuscript. The questions come up: what's true, what part of it's true, and what part of it really isn't. I mean, it's hard to tell as far as I'm concerned.
Well, I've heard it said by particularly many Dutch hunters that Brownie Holmes denied writing the manuscript. And that's true. He didn't write it. He and his father told the story. They wanted the story out about their search without giving away too much information to a guy named Kinnison. And he took copious notes on it and typed them up later. And I read a story on Desert USA from a gentleman who said he studied the notes quite a bit, and he felt like the middle of the notes was worded one way, but the beginning and the end looked like it was written by somebody else. And he's exactly right, because when Jacob Waltz told Richard Holmes about the board house, Holmes went out and verified this information before he began his search. Well, in 1891, when he was told that, the ranch had been sold by Mrs. Cavanis in 1880, so he had to check with Marlowe, who owned it at the time. And he was able to verify that the 3 children and the woman actually lived there at the board house at that time. And now we get into the manuscript. And how do we know that these things that I just told you could possibly come about without anything in writing to tell you? And the reason we know is because of a man named Clay Wurst. Clay Wurst I've known for 40 years. And Clay is one of the most honest people that I know. And I'm going to tell you how I know he's honest, because I've had several dealings with him. When we found the land at the museum is on, I helped him survey the land. I took the first buyer to him as a real estate agent, and he handled the deal. But you know, in a nonprofit organization, and I suppose it's that true in other organizations, a member of the board can't make a pecuniary profit. Now, I had to look up what a pecuniary profit was. And you're not supposed to be able to profit from something you learned while you were on the board. In other words, it's like insider trading. So when I took the first buyer to Clay, in order to avoid even the appearance of wrongdoing, he resigned from the board. He made the deal, and the sale was over. He didn't even take a commission. Then, after the whole thing was over, he went back on the board. Now that's an honest man who will do anything he can to avoid the appearance of evil. And he was partners with Brownie Holmes for 20 years. If Brownie told him everything that his dad had told him, he told to Clay. So Clay would know about the board house and the manuscript because Brownie told him about that stuff. When Brownie and his dad were telling Mr. Kinnison about the story, Mr. Kennison must have saw some dollar signs where he could make some money, because he flowered this whole thing up to the point that when Brownie and his dad saw it, it made them look like Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett all rolled into one, and they refused to go any further with it. In fact, Brownie kept the manuscript there at the Quarter Circle U house, the bunkhouse, and he was ripping pages off of it and lighting the fire in the kitchen stove. And that kitchen stove, by the way, is in the museum to this day. And so the gentleman that was talking about sandwiching the middle between the front and the end, he was absolutely correct, because somebody at Quarter Circle U, and Clay didn't say who and I didn't ask him, found the manuscript in the bunkhouse and gave it back to Kennison. And the whole front and rear of the missing pages had to be recreated. That's exactly right. And that's why it looked like it was done by two different people. And then it ended up in the hands of somebody else named Higham or somebody like that, and went on from there.
That's really such a shame too, because knowing Brownie Holmes, that could have been such a good historical piece for us to have in his hand. You know, and from Clay, we get the statement that Brownie Holmes had said to him. Brownie said, "My father never lied to me, Clay, and I've never lied to you."
Clay Wurst would never lie to anybody, and I'm not going to lie to you.
Thank you for watching this episode of Mysteries of the Superstition Mountains.